history, philosophy, and religion, and also hold the position of Hundair Professor in Religion and Culture. And I'm pleased to welcome you this evening to a Hundair sponsored lecture by Mark Rozell of George Mason University, where Professor Rozell is Professor of Public Policy. And his topic is going to be on religion and the American Presidency. And he's recently authored and edited books on this topic. If you listen closely to, well, actually not closely, if you just listen to campaign coverage on National Public Radio, you're likely to hear Professor Rozell at some time or another in the last couple of weeks and probably the next couple of weeks. Just to say a little bit about Professor Rozell, who's been here today and just thinks the world of Oregon weather. Just told him it's always like this, especially in November, December, it gets even better. Anyway, Professor Rozell is the author of 9 books. He's the editor of some 20 books on various topics in U.S. government and politics, including the presidency and religion and politics. The latest books that he's either edited or co-authored include The President's Czars, Undermining Congress and the Constitution, the Oxford Handbook of Southern Politics, Religion and the American Presidency, which he'll be speaking about and speaking on that topic this evening, and interest groups in American campaigns, the new face of electioneering, and also executive privilege, presidency power, secrecy, and accountability. He's testified before Congress on numerous occasions, and he's lectured extensively in the United States and in many countries on virtually every continent, save for Africa and Antarctica. He does frequent opinion and editorial columns for USA Today and Politico, and is often asked, because of the proximity to George Mason, asked for political commentary from the Washington Post and Time Magazine, and as I said, is a very frequent commentator on National Public Radio. So we're very delighted to have him with us this evening to make this presentation on religion in the American Presidency, especially given the current election in 2.5 weeks and the sort of element of an interesting religious dynamic, sort of unprecedented religious dynamic. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rozell to Oregon State.
Thank you, Courtney, for the kindness of your invitation and your hospitality today. You, your colleagues, graduate students who met with me for lunch session and for a really wonderful dinner at the Riverview, very impressed. And I was going to say at the outset that I understand this is the weather that you have here all the time, and I really look forward to coming back because it was just a spectacular day. And Courtney was quite feeling pleased to walk me around campus and show me the beautiful venues here. He said he got off yesterday his important conference paper, and he felt that freedom that academics feel once you finish a research paper, that you can just get outside a little bit and enjoy the elements. And today was absolutely the perfect day for it. So it's been a delightful visit, although an entirely too short one, I'm sorry to say, because I'm heading back to home tomorrow. My topic is on religion and the presidency, particularly focusing on the 2012 elections. Actually, when we first talked about me coming here, I thought really my focus would be on my latest book, which is on religion and the American presidency. And within the last couple of days, I really thought there's a big election going on right now, but there's not a lot of talk about the religion factor, say, as there was 4 years ago, or especially 8 years ago. So I think for tonight I want to pay a little bit more attention to that part of my research agenda and get a good conversation going leave adequate time for questions and answers on the role of religion in this campaign. But I will also do my duty and talk about the book on religion in the American presidency, because my colleagues and I who worked on this project together, that began with an academic conference several years ago, in which we brought together colleagues, sociologists, historians, political scientists, theologians, to talk about religion in the presidency, really found out a lot of things that are counter to the conventional wisdom about the role of faith and religion in the lives and the policies and politics of various presidents and their administrations. So I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about that, because we do have, I think, some very interesting and, again, counter-conventional findings. I'm a political scientist by training, and I did my work at exactly the same time at the same university, actually, as Courtney. I found out today. We were both at the University of Virginia from, am I allowed to say? Is that okay? Giving away our ages and everything. Maybe that's not polite. 1982 through 87, we didn't meet each other there. We were in different academic programs entirely. I just found out today we were there exactly the same sequence of time doing our graduate studies. But there were no courses on the intersection of religion and politics in political science. And it was really difficult to get social scientists, particularly in political science, to acknowledge the importance of religion as an explanatory variable when studying political behavior, political motivations of citizens and leaders, voting behavior. And it was a struggle for people in the profession who study the field of religion and politics to really get that acceptance within the profession that this is an important area of inquiry. So I didn't have any training in my graduate studies specifically in the area that became my major focus of research later in my career. But I became increasingly convinced over time that if you want to study and understand what makes a lot of our political leaders tick, what motivates a lot of citizens in the political world, you absolutely have to understand the importance of religion as a political variable. Much of my research in the past has focused on the rise of the evangelical right in American politics beginning in the 1970s and the transformations in American politics that have resulted from the rise of the so-called Christian right movement, and then eventually the development of all kinds of political coalitions that a few decades ago were unthinkable, particularly, for example, the current powerful coalition within the Republican Party between conservative evangelical Protestants and conservative Catholics. Years ago, the antipathy of evangelical Protestants toward Catholics was so deep that I found that in the late 1960s, early 1970s, before the Roe versus Wade decision, there were, for example, Southern Baptist organizations that actively worked against enactment at the state level of anti-abortion laws because of the fear that the Catholics would get too much power, and a lot of these initiatives were being pushed by Catholic-led organizations. It's unthinkable today that there would be that kind of deep antipathy that would actually lead groups to oppose anti-abortion or pro-life legislation, whatever your preferred language. I'm playing neutral, by the way. And today, you see that there are comfortable coalitions between groups that once could not get along with each other, who have found ways to put aside the question of who's going to find heaven and focus instead on their common interest in politics and what they can agree on in this world that matters to the policy process. So I teach in the School of Public Policy, so this all has to come back for me to policy at some point. But I want to talk a little bit about 2012 as the year of the unexpected with regard to the intersection of religion and politics. Here we have 4 national ticket candidates and the one mainline Protestant, that used to be the requirement for becoming president, is the Democratic presidential nominee. During the Republican primaries, evangelical Protestants strongly supported the Catholic candidate, Rick Santorum, while Catholics supported a Mormon. Fully 1/3 of Republicans and about 1/2 of evangelical Protestants think that the mainline Protestant, Barack Obama, is a Muslim. Fewer than half of the general public identifies Barack Obama as a Christian, only 49% in a recent survey. This is people being asked the religious identities of the leading candidates running for national office this year, and astonishingly, less than half said that Barack Obama, or they know that Barack Obama is a Christian. 6 in 10 independent voters say that a candidate's religion matters very importantly to them in making their voting decision. And yet, less than half of those voters, too, can correctly identify the President of the United States' own religious identity. Oddly, as religion has increased in salience in modern elections, again, going back just a few decades ago in graduate school, you couldn't get people to take this seriously as a variable worthy of study. And now there is so much talk about the importance of religion in politics, so much media coverage. The subfield of religion and politics within my discipline has exploded in membership. It's one of the fastest growing. Many dissertations and formal studies done on this, and yet with all this increased emphasis and attention, public misunderstanding actually has been increasing about candidates, their religious identities, and how their religion affects or influences their policy positions. Although pollsters and political experts expressed astonishment back in 2008 that about 12 to 15% of the public misidentified Barack Obama as a Muslim, and they expected that this result would be corrected over time as people got more information. 4 years later, the percentage of Americans who wrongly identify his religion has increased by 50%. So it's now somewhere around 21% of the general voting population. I was speaking to one of the graduate students here in philosophy, and he said he was going to be here. I think he may be somewhere, but he was saying what a terrible commentary on modern American democracy that presupposes that people have some base of knowledge of factual information in order to make informed decisions. That information that's so easily available and presented out there before the public, so many people are not getting it right. Surveys show that about 1/4 of Americans say that they are less likely to vote for someone who is a Mormon. So the Pew Center for Study of Religion and Public Life has done a lot of large surveys on topics such as this, and they ask people in a national poll, would you be more or less likely to vote for someone if that person is and then they give all the major religious identities. And you find out that for most religious categories, most Americans are rather tolerant and accepting, but around 40% of Americans say they're less likely to vote for someone if they know that person is a Muslim, and 25% less likely to vote for someone if they know he or she is a Mormon. The bulk of those giving that answer are evangelical Protestants, the religious bloc most strongly supporting Mitt Romney, a Mormon. If the polls hold up until Election Day, and this is fascinating to me, Romney will do better with these voters than did John McCain, a Baptist, 4 years ago, even with Sarah Palin on the presidential ticket. And so this is the year in which a Mormon Catholic ticket has attracted the strong and enthusiastic support of evangelical Protestants. Another interesting development that's playing an important role in this election year, and you may have seen this in some recent news stories because the Pew Center actually released a study on this, and it got significant media attention within the past few days, and that is the rise of the nones, N-O-N-E-S, that is, the people who identify no religious identity. In 1995, that was 6%. Today, it's 19%. And I find that extremely important and fascinating that at a time when there has been, again, rising salience of religion as an important factor in the electoral landscape, so much more focus on religion so much more emphasis by candidates on emphasizing faith and God talk in campaigns. The percentage of people who've decided that they don't affiliate with any religion has tripled in just 17 years. So we could ask the question, why is that happening? And I think it is partially explained, perhaps, I believe, exactly by the increased emphasis on religion in political campaigns, that although it has actively engaged certain populations and taken some previously apolitical populations, relatively apolitical populations, including conservative evangelical Protestants, and made them extremely active democratic citizens now. On the other hand, I think some Americans, particularly of the younger generation, as the data are showing, are getting turned off by the constant emphasis on religion and God talk in political campaigns. So I'll talk a little bit about this as I continue, but there are some important generational differences that are taking place here as well. The unexpected or strange circumstances I just identified are explainable with reasons, I think, both good and bad. Again, I pointed out before that prior to the Roe decision, there were Southern Baptist groups that lobbied against state-level anti-abortion bills out of fear of Catholic beliefs being ensconced in the public policy and Catholics getting too powerful. Today, you see at evangelical colleges and universities, for example, courses being taught on the philosophy of John Paul II, and young evangelicals who refer to John Paul II as the evangelical pope. And you see lots of political coalition building going on between evangelical Protestants and Catholics today. And again, once rival groups that have set aside their differences in order to work together on issues that they share in politics. And it's had, I think, some positive spillovers into matters of culture and tolerance and the like that I would say are good effects of the changes that have taken place as a result of the rising interest in religion and the rise of religion as a major factor in the motivations of many citizens and how they behave politically. The downside is when powerful coalitions become vehicles to more effectively denigrate smaller religious minorities, as is happening especially toward Muslims, or to question the authenticity of a person's claim to be of a particular faith. Again, consider Barack Obama and his Christianity. Some media treatment of religion in presidential politics, I think, has also increased the public confusion and misunderstanding that is out in the public right now. There are surveys that show that those who get their political information primarily from Fox News or from talk radio are drastically more likely to believe that, for example, Barack Obama is a Muslim than those who watch other news outlets or read newspapers. Now, it could be, of course, that people who are predisposed to believe certain things consume certain types of media, but I also would not neglect the impact that certain media can have on perpetuating certain beliefs, some of which are just simply wrong. Another important significant change in recent years is the effort by Democrats to close the so-called God gap. The most important development in the modern era regarding religion and politics, again, has been the rise of the evangelical right since the 1970s. But since then, for decades, it seemed that the religious right possessed a sort of monopoly over political discourse regarding the role of faith and morals in politics. It took a long time for Democrats to begin to challenge religious right ownership of the public dialogue on faith and morality. And that brings me now to the strong impact that I think President Obama has had on the religion and politics dialogue. Barack Obama rose to national prominence, actually, at a time when many perceived his political party as strongly unfriendly toward religion. In 2004, there was a national survey taken for Time magazine that asked Americans whether the presidential candidates, John Kerry, George W. Bush, were people who they perceived to be of strong or deep religious faith. For John Kerry, 7% of Americans consider this man, a practicing Catholic and former seminary student actually, to be a person of deep religious faith. Very counterintuitive, but that was the perception. A 2005 national survey found that only 29% of Americans considered the Democratic Party, quote unquote, friendly toward religion. Now, when you have national surveys saying that upwards of 70% or more of Americans consider it important that the president be a person of strong religious faith. This is a poll that's been asked for a number of years by the Pew Forum, and the numbers have been rather steadily in the 70+% range of Americans saying that they want their president to be a person of strong religious faith, and 71% of the public saying that one political party is not friendly to religion. You know that that party has an image problem that needs to be taken on because, again, religion does matter to so many Americans in making up their minds about candidates, parties, public policy, and the like. In his 2004 convention speech that brought Barack Obama to the national stage, he wove together a number of biblical themes and references that were immediately recognized by religious Christians. His references to "I am my brother's keeper," "We worship an awesome God," and "to hope as a belief in things not seen," all have deep meaning among evangelical Protestants. In a 2006 speech, Barack Obama directly addressed the issue of the God gap, chiding conservatives for acting like they are the uniquely only religious Americans, and then chiding progressives for their hesitancy, as he put it, to get preaching, and their failure to, and I quote, "tap into the moral underpinnings of the nation." Obama was making it clear from the outset that he was not going to allow himself, like other Democratic presidential aspirants before him, to be characterized as anti-religion. And given his longstanding membership in a mainline Protestant denomination and his evangelical style of discourse, Obama indeed had the ability to get preachy and sound credible and eloquent doing so. In early 2008, actually, I participated in a panel discussion on religion and the elections in Washington near my home, and was doing so along with a prominent conservative evangelical figure who told me privately during the lunch break that he was hopeful that Barack Obama would defeat Hillary Clinton for the Democratic Party nomination. Now, I was kind of curious about this because you may remember at that time that Mrs. Clinton was running well to the right of Barack Obama, and this is a very conservative individual who was telling me that he was hoping the far more progressive candidate, at least as he was campaigning at that stage for the party nomination, was his preference. So I asked him to explain, and he said as a committed evangelical, he can tell which candidates are the fakers, that is, the ones who invoke religious discourse without really understanding it or meaning it, and those who are authentic. So I've done a lot of research on the evangelical right. I've written books on the rise of the Christian right in American politics. I've interviewed many leaders and activists in the movement, and one of the things that just drives them crazy, completely understandable from their perspective, is the fakers, particularly Republican candidates who, in the context of a nomination campaign, will mouth the words that religious conservative voters want to hear because it's politically advantageous to do so, but then they get into office and they govern as mainstream Republicans, and religious conservatives feel that they've been hosed time and time again. And that includes Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, a number of other prominent Republicans who, rhetorically said the right things, made the right promises, but then when they governed, stepped away from the social issues agenda and continually told the religious right leaders and activists, sit down, be quiet, wait your turn. We don't want to stir things up too much. You know, your time will come eventually. And from their perspective, they're absolutely right to be feeling betrayed by many candidates who have made the promises but haven't followed through. But this individual is saying that he and others were getting a better ear, a better understanding of who the fakers are. And he said he could hear in Obama an authentic man of faith. Despite the policy differences that he had with Obama, he was convinced that Obama would at least understand the appeals of conservative Christians and not go on a war path against them, as he assumed Hillary Clinton would. And so he felt like they would get listened to in an Obama administration if indeed he were successful and won the presidency. Many of Obama's actions since taking office seem to lend credibility to this expectation. There were symbolic actions such as having Reverend Rick Warren, a major religious conservative figure, lead a prayer at the inauguration, the continuation of the White House prayer breakfast, the expanding role of the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, although it was renamed and somewhat recast. These things all resonated with evangelicals, but ultimately I think such natural opponents of Democrats will judge a president by his policies. And several of the president's actions, especially the HHS mandate on contraception, have deeply offended many religious traditionalists, evangelicals and especially Catholics. I think also there is a gap between the conservative evangelicals at the elite level and those at the mass level. Even if some elites, such as this individual I had spoken to, understood that Obama was a different type of Democrat and that maybe they could do business with him, the activist core of the religious right has not been so open-minded or willing to accept the possibility that he's someone who they can do business with. Again, a sizable minority of Americans, made up largely of conservative evangelicals, don't even believe that the president is a Christian. Despite all of his outreach efforts, Obama has not made inroads with religious conservatives. He has not moved the needle politically in any way to attract some of their support. There was some discussion after the midterm 2006 elections, for example, that maybe evangelicals were opening up to appeals by Democrats because the needle had shifted about 5 or 6 percentage points from the most recent election cycle. And there was a little bit of shifting from 2004 to 2008. But ultimately, the evangelical core of the Republican Party has remained solidly Republican. It hasn't been breaking away. And it's a topic for a whole nother lecture or discussion, but there was for a time some discussion and analysis of evangelical voting, looking at whether the intergenerational differences would result in a loosening up of Republican loyalties among those younger evangelicals who were expressing in surveys, this is all relative of course, more progressive views on some issues, such as gay marriage or on the environment, on AIDS, on aid to the poor. In other words, some of the surveys were showing that younger evangelicals were much less conservative than their parents' and grandparents' generations, but ultimately still voting heavily Republican because the core life issues were still the most salient to them in their voting decisions, and that essentially has not changed. Evangelical disdain for Barack Obama actually has heightened and intensified over time despite a lot of his outreach effort. And in turn, as this election looms, he has stopped reaching out to those who he knows never will vote for him. And he has focused, quite rightly in the campaign context, on his base and on reaching swing voters. For the 2012 campaign, polls show that the configuration of religious-based voting will be consistent with recent election cycles, with heavy attenders of religious services of most faiths voting Republican, and secular and occasional attenders of religious services voting Democrat. For my parents' generation, the question could be, how will the Protestants vote? How will the Catholics vote? I always joke that my mom and dad, My mom passed a few years ago. My dad is 87 years old, but when they married almost 7 decades ago, it was a mixed marriage, a Protestant and a Catholic. You know, they actually eloped because you know, interfamily hostilities over this this unlikely union. But anyway, that was generations ago. But you could track voting with religious identity much more than you can now. The breakdown in voting today is not based so much on religious identification, but on religious practice. The more intensely religious are the most likely to vote Republican, with some exceptions among some small religious minority groups. And those who are more secular or loosely affiliated or occasional attenders of religious services heavily vote Democrat. And that's the religious divide in elections, more so than any divide between religious identifications. The intensity factor, of course, is going to be key to the outcome this year with a projected close election. And that, of course, is the big unknown right now. But I find it fascinating that in one set of surveys, asking people if the religion of Barack Obama or of Mitt Romney is different from your own. Is this somebody who is from a whole different religious perspective or outlook from you? Over 40% of Americans say yes about each one of these individuals. Barack Obama, again, belongs to a mainline Protestant denomination, one of the oldest in America, and yet more than 4 out of 10 Americans consider him someone whose religion is fundamentally different from their own. And the same for Mitt Romney, which of course is not surprising since he is a Mormon, but again, conservative evangelicals comprise the largest core of people giving this answer, that they see each one of these individuals as different from themselves. And they have shown in surveys, again, a distrust of Obama's professed Christian faith, but also a discomfort with a Mormon candidate. Polling data showed that Romney, nonetheless, has firmly secured the support of the evangelical core of his party. Intense disdain of Barack Obama runs deeper among conservative evangelicals than their discomfort with Mitt Romney's religion. For now, denominational labels matter much less for these GOP voters than whether a candidate is pro-life and pro-traditional marriage, again, using their preferred language. Very telling is that when Mitt Romney announced first for president, a majority of evangelicals expressed a negative view of him. By the time he received his party's nomination and he represented the one and only chance to get rid of Barack Obama, his rating shot up to a 70% positive rating among this group. Finally, on the campaign itself, what I also find striking is how much the candidates are avoiding mentions of their faith identities. I think understanding the potential to intensify their opposition. They both, in essence, have disarmed in this regard. Romney speaks only very generally about his faith and his belief in God and how that informs his role as a public servant. There is no mention of his Mormon faith. Barack Obama, who I'm sure does not want to raise the specter of Reverend Wright and all the controversies from 4 years ago that almost unhinged his presidential campaign, and also does not want to remind that significant minority of Americans of his religious identity, which they don't even understand accurately, also has decided it's better not to focus on his religious identity. And so his rhetoric is very, very different in this regard from what it was 4 years ago, when it was very striking just how much he, more than the Republican candidate, John McCain, engaged in God talk during that election cycle. Religion and God talk simply have not featured as prominently in this campaign cycle as it did 4 and 8 years ago. And again, because I think the dynamics of this campaign are just so significantly different. Okay, I want to leave some time for questions and answers, so I'll talk a little bit about my book on religion and the American Presidency. So I now apologize for going backwards, but I'm going to do that just a little bit for you so I cover this territory. And then I'll leave plenty of time in which you can ask questions about the historical information I'm about to present or about the current campaign, which I suspect is always much more interesting and relevant now. We convened, as I said, a group of scholars. It began in 2007. The book has now gone into a second edition, recently published, to look into the role of religion to the lives and to the politics and policies of various presidents and their administrations, going back to George Washington. Obviously, the book is selective in its treatment of presidents. We could cover all of them in a single volume without writing an entire encyclopedia-length book. Publishers don't want that. But we did strategically pick a number of presidents from the early years of the Republic through the modern era for analysis. And without regard to any preconceived notion about what the scholars should find in their studies, it was very striking to us at the conference that one after another, the scholars assigned to study different presidents presented a very similar conclusion, that the neglect of the study of the faith factor and the role of religion in the lives of these individuals and in the politics and policies of their administrations has left out an enormous amount of important information to understanding these chief executives in our past, understanding what made them tick, what motivated them, what motivated many of their most important policy decisions. Even some of the best-selling biographies of presidents who were deeply religious and guided in many of their decisions by faith largely ignore the role that religion played in their lives and in their administrations. These would include McCulloch's works on Truman, Ambrose's works on Eisenhower. Numerous studies on Ronald Reagan are notable among many others. So much of what we found, again, was counter to the conventional wisdom, to the understanding of religion to the lives of these presidents and to their politics and policies. There is significant literature on the religious beliefs and practices of certain presidents who we immediately recognize as ones who were strongly guided by faith, and those, of course, who wore their religiosity, some people don't like that word, but very openly, Jimmy Carter, George W. Bush, most prominently in the modern era. But again, the role of faith for many modern presidents of deep religious convictions did not attract much interest by political scientists and biographers, and our book found that there's so much more to understanding the presidency if we examine more closely the importance of the religion factor. And so various scholars looked at the private papers, correspondences of various past presidents, worked with a lot of original archival data. In the case of Ronald Reagan, the colleague writing on Reagan eventually published a book from this research, which for a brief period of time was on the bestseller list, the New York Times bestsellers list. But he got amazing access to people close to Ronald Reagan and discovered the religious Reagan, the story that really wasn't told while he was president, and found counter to the common portrayal of Ronald Reagan as someone who was indifferent to organized religion, never went to church while he was president, who merely mouthed certain rhetoric to please the social conservative wing of his party, that he really wasn't authentic about it. All of these characterizations, Professor Kenger found, were simply not accurate representations of the real Ronald Reagan. And so he discovered that, for example, Ronald Reagan was an active churchgoer up until the time he became president, and he became one again as soon as he left office. But for reasons of personal security and not wanting to be disruptive to Sunday services, for people who would be distracted by the fact that the President of the United States was there, he chose to worship privately and not do so publicly. But chapters on, for example, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, two presidents, mid-20th century presidents, widely portrayed as either indifferent to, or in Eisenhower's case, hostile to organized religion. Never really had any religion, didn't care very much about it, and yet each of these scholars found that each man was very, very deeply religious in his own way. As the scholar on Eisenhower said, the outward expressions of a person don't tell you the inner beliefs necessarily, and you have to take into account the reality that in mid-20th century America, it was in part considered unseemly or improper for people in public life to so overtly push their religion or engage in God talk. That didn't mean that these people were not religious, but they understood that there was a boundary there in public life that should not be crossed. And of course, the lack of engagement in open, what we today call God talk, or emphasis on the role of faith in politics and how it informs policies, led many people to believe that these presidents simply were not guided at all by faith and were not terribly religious individuals. I'm going to stop in just a couple minutes because I've got so much material from the book, and it's a long book, and I've got a limited period of time in which to present it. But again, a lot of the analysis is very counter-conventional. Bill Clinton, for example, the author, found that the Southern Baptist roots of Bill Clinton played such a deep role in his life, in his political discourse, and this scholar too was countering the conventional wisdom about Bill Clinton. Of course, in the 1990s, the most vocal Americans when it came to faith and politics were the religious conservatives, and they were, of course, absolutely appalled by Bill Clinton's personal behavior. And they could only see him in one way, and that opinion simply wasn't going to change. But they so much dominated much of the discourse at that time about the intersection of faith and politics that it was hard for Bill Clinton to be taken seriously when he said that he had a religious mentor, that he sought spiritual advice from a spiritual advisor who came to the White House every single week. And again, the portrait presented in the chapter Bill Clinton showcases a man who's very, very different from many of the popular perceptions. And by the way, the chapter on George W. Bush as well. I used to do a lot of lecturing internationally on the intersection of religion and politics. I still do some, but during the Bush era, I was invited numerous times through the US State Department to do lecture programs on religion and politics, and in part because there was a belief within the US government that misperceptions abroad about the role that religion was playing in the policies and politics of the George W. Bush administration were causing so many problems for the United States in terms of how people understood us, how people understood what motivates us in our policy decisions. And so when I would lecture abroad, I would tell people that when I'm in the United States lecturing on this topic, I spend a lot of time trying to convince people that religion is a really important variable in understanding American politics. But now that I'm here in Europe, I'm spending a lot of time trying to convince you it's not the only variable that matters. But then, that was a talk I gave during the Bush era, in which people would kind of get that when I would explain that everything that George Bush did with regard to Middle East policy, war policy, the U.S.-Israel relations, the Palestine question, wasn't because Pat Robertson was whispering in his ear every day and telling him what to do, but it was almost sort of conspiratorial theories about the role that the religious right was playing in the making of U.S. foreign policy in particular. So I found myself in the sort of odd position of trying to disavow people of that notion that religion was driving everything in American public policy, particularly with regard to our foreign policy. Our chapter on George W. Bush really takes to task a lot of the literature on religion in his presidency for having a very strong political and partisan slant. And here was a man who, by the way, who felt that one of his deepest callings as a man of faith was to try to do what he could about AIDS in Africa, and pushed very, very hard when he saw that there was no significant domestic political gain to secure billions of dollars for a cause that he had felt very, very strongly about. So the author is pointing out that there are very different sides to the whole story about George W. Bush's religion and the impact that had on his presidency. To conclude, one of the challenges, I think, in studying the religion-presidency intersection is indeed that all presidents find it useful politically to connect religious themes at times to policy goals or to sustain political support. That's now expected. That's the norm. Evoking the symbols of U.S. civil religion and using religious-based discourse are expected roles today for our presidents. It's not always clear whether presidents evoking certain symbols or using certain rhetoric do so because they believe that they have to, or because it comes naturally to them. Paul Kanger's study of Reagan is particularly instructive because for years the conventional wisdom was that the former president merely was using symbols and words to please religious conservatives. But yet, what he found in his research was that this interpretation simply was wrong. But the challenge in engaging in this type of research and analysis is trying to filter out what is a sincere expression of faith and what is politically calculated. And again, it goes back to that individual I talked to who said you have to have a little bit of an ear to understand who are the fakers and who are authentic. In the chapter on Bill Clinton, one of the more interesting findings was a content study of speeches by American presidents. Bill Clinton, more than any other president, including George Bush at the time of this study, before Barack Obama, by the way, when that chapter was written, invoked Jesus Christ in his speeches, far more than George W. Bush did. And so, again, another sort of counter conventional finding, but again, the former president's detractors would say it was politically calculated, it was insincere, he really didn't mean it, and those of us studying in this area have to try to make some sense out of all the public discourse out there on religion and politics, which, by the way, gets really overheated at times, and try to bring some sensible discussion to this whole topic. I teach a course on the intersection of religion and politics, and it's the only course in which I do this, and I've ever done anything like this, where I say right up front to my syllabus that I understand that this is a topic that brings out some really strong emotions sometimes, and understandably so. And that I expect my students to engage at an academic level or style of discourse and discussion on this topic, and kind of check your emotions at the door a little bit when coming into the classroom. But I also recognize people have very deeply held beliefs in this area, and that's really, really hard for them to do. So as we've seen American politics become more divisive over time, commensurate with the rise in the importance of religion as a factor in American politics, I don't think we can ignore the role that religion plays also in the current circumstance that is so regrettable of a deeply divided country where people from different viewpoints really don't talk to each other very well. I give President Obama credit that he had, perhaps too idealistically, when bursting onto the national scene, when he first became president, thinking that he could bridge those divides in American politics. And he found out rather quickly it's not so easy to do. In fact, perhaps regrettably, it's not possible, at least in the short term. So I will stop there, and like I said, leave time for your questions. Okay. I immediately saw a hand right here, so yeah.
Why is there more interest in the study of religion and politics at the same time there's less God taught? And do you think that the shift in the Party will continue after the election?
Yeah, very good questions. On the second part first, the survey data show that there is no splintering in the evangelical, among, let me put white evangelicals, okay, who comprise the core of Republican Party voting. The white evangelical vote for John McCain was around 72%. For George Bush, it was around 80%. And the surveys have Mitt Romney around 75, 76% right now. And again, as I had mentioned, some surveys show that there is a generational difference on some policy issues within the evangelical community, with younger evangelicals being less conservative than their parents or grandparents, but their voting patterns are still consistently and strongly Republican. So I can't predict the future so well, of course, but I'm not sure exactly how Democrats break into the white evangelical core of the Republican Party, as long as they are the pro-choice party. Right now, even the young evangelicals, many of whom are expressing less conservative or more moderate views, however you want to say it, on even issues such as gay marriage. They're not changing their voting behavior. They're not voting Democrat. So you're asking why the increase in importance of religion, but the decrease in God talk. And again, I think it's just a strategic calculation on the part of the presidential campaigns right now that there is more loss than gain for Romney and Obama to talk directly about their own religious identities. But I would say that there is not a substantial decline in talking about faith in politics necessarily. Mitt Romney talks in a very general way about the importance of faith and being a believer. He finished his closing answer right in the latest presidential debate, talking about his deep religious faith and commitment and how that informs who he is and what he does and why he's in public life. So I think as long as the candidates keep it on sort of a general level, it's politically safe for them to do so. I saw some other hands up. I thought. Yes, please.
I am wondering, okay, phrase this. It seems to me that one would hush and observe, which is different from skeptical scorekeeping. Things that are very clear signs of the depth of family relationship. And along those veins which display the roots in a human being. Doesn't that speak about it? And what you mentioned about a division of belief systems, where if you've got a world culture, faith, belief, hope, philanthropy, all good things.
Right.
And then on more of a traditional North Shores, the Christian aspect. And then these little piles of different names within, and not that huge of a variance within Christian belief. Why is there such a focus on dissension and difference rather than likenesses?
Right. Yeah, because we're dealing with politics, I think is the answer, and policy. I think that's the answer. That at the end of the day, Mitt Romney and Barack Obama, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, have some significant differences on the social issues agenda, and that's what drives the political behavior of some religiously motivated Americans in deciding who they're going to vote for. So the fact that there are many similarities, they're both men of faith, both deeply religious, both observant, both good family men. You can candidates these days just don't stop telling you, how good their families are. like me, I'm still married or something. I don't know. You know, I got 5 kids or two lovely daughters. You know, you know, on that level, there are many similarities between them. But at the end of the day, if there are policy differences that matter to groups of Americans who feel very strongly about those issues, they are, and perhaps they should, you know, engage in some very, very strong politicking, you know, to express their differences on these issues and make sure that they're highlighted in campaigns and that people of similar minds get out and vote on the basis of the candidates' positions on these issues. So as long as we're dealing in the political world and there are very big stakes involved in who wins and who loses elections, it's going to be hard ever to get to that point where the emphasis is going to be on the similarities. The focus is always going to be on the differences. And of course, as you know, candidates emphasize their differences in campaigns in order to mobilize their base support and to try to break away support from their opposition. So, you know, on a host of issues, by the way, you can see that there are not dramatic differences necessarily between Democrats and Republicans or between the presidential nominees. But if you follow the campaign rhetoric and look at the ads, boy, you would think they're so profoundly different from each other. Yeah. Yes, please.
Well, could you talk a little bit about some of the early presidents and the idea of U.S. as a Christian nation or not, and what the presidents that era thought about?
Yeah, and this is something we talk about quite extensively in the book. I mean, going back to, for example, George Washington. You know, one of the things that I find fascinating is how much Americans want to claim. Americans of different persuasions want to claim the founding generation as their own, right? In order to justify modern positions. And so my author on George Washington, for example, says that you have so many partisan advocates arguing positions about George Washington and religion. On the one hand, he supposedly was a man of robust Orthodox Christian faith. Okay? You can find entire books arguing that was George Washington. Others saying he was a deist or a Unitarian. He merely attended church to assure pious Americans that their leader was devout. It was all just politically motivated, you know, to be a proper symbol of the nation, but he wasn't that deeply religious. My author said Washington was a theistic rationalist, sort of a hybrid system of thought combining Christianity, natural religion, and rationalism. You know, ultimately, he concludes that Washington was a religious man. He turned to religion during difficult times in his life, you know, as many Americans do. No, I mean, he doesn't agree that Washington had this idea that we are a quote-unquote Christian nation, for example. Thomas Jefferson, you know, famously articulated this concept of a wall of separation between church and state, and there are large bodies of scholarship arguing that he was arguing a very strict separationist view. Well, what does my contributor find about Thomas Jefferson? I found absolutely fascinating. He directed government funds to support the work of Christian missionaries to civilize and convert Native Americans. So people say that the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives had no historical precedent at all, right? And Thomas Jefferson was giving government funds for this purpose. My author reports, with his approval, the federal government encouraged the Presbyterian ministers' work among the Cherokees by appropriating federal money to found what was designed as a Christian school to teach religion along with other subjects. So this goes way beyond the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives. But it also contradicts portrayals of Thomas Jefferson as somebody who believed in an absolutely strict separation between church and state. So, you know, the authors, the contributors to my volume, challenge the interpretation among some that the constitutional founders of our country explicitly sought to found and embody within our governmental institutions a Christian nation. Okay, read the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and lead founding documents, find that evidence for me. That was what motivated the constitutional founders, and that forming a distinctly Christian nation was their overriding purpose. So many of the writings focused on the importance of religious freedom and the right of people to worship as they please. The namesake of my university, prominent among them, the principal author of our Bill of Rights, right, George Mason, who believed very, very strongly and wrote very forcefully on religious freedom as a foundational principle of a functioning democratic republic, that you can't have one without protecting religious freedom. Yes, please.
Who was a real surprise in this research, and why?
Yeah. Even though I had studied the intersection of religion and politics for years, I was not quite prepared for the extent that my Reagan author found about the depth of Reagan's religiosity. That ran so completely counter to everything I had read and studied about Reagan. And I have in some of my writings even characterized, as I think I said even earlier in my speech, that Reagan is among a number of prominent Republican figures who mouthed the rhetoric that pleased certain constituencies, but that he must not have been terribly authentic, because he didn't go out and work hard on behalf of the social issues agenda. He always put it on the back burner. The Reagan presidency was mostly about what? Reducing taxes and fighting the Cold War, and the social issues did not go to the fore. So quite naturally, many people, myself included, were convinced that he was not strongly driven by religion as a motivating factor for what he did in his public life. But he would throw in every once in a while in a speech, let's put God back into the classroom, or say that he favored an anti-abortion or pro-life amendment to the US federal Constitution, which he never did anything, to try to effect. He just said the words, and he gave a speech once a year at the pro-life rally in Washington, D.C., and, say, okay, I did enough for those people, move on. So that was kind of my understanding, and yet Professor Kanger's research convinced me that there's more there. And a lot of it had to do with what Kanger described as the principal calling of Reagan's presidency was the fight against the Soviet Union, right, and the Cold War. The chapters on Truman and Reagan in that regard were remarkably similar. So Harry Truman had written a private letter to President of Baptist Alliance saying about his foreign policy, we must put on the armor of God. And in a lot of his correspondences, you find that much of his belief about the importance of fighting the Cold War was grounded in a belief against atheistic communism, and the importance of amending that. Dwight Eisenhower at one point, before becoming president, said to people who were asking about what about religion? You don't go to church. Ever since you went to West Point, you seem to have given it up. And he said, "I am the most intensely religious man that I know." His expressions, by the way, of his religious faith were not always the most articulate. My co-author kind of had some fun with that in that chapter, by the way. But on the other hand, he was the first president to be baptized in the White House. In God we trust. I mean, he wrote his own inaugural prayer. There were outward expressions of the importance of religion in his life during his presidency that certainly should suggest that he was not adverse to religion at all. Yes. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about John Kennedy? Because I remember when he was running for president, it just seemed like there was so much talk about how he would take direction from the Pope, and didn't want to elect a Catholic.
Yes. Yeah. And that was the big breakthrough, you know. So my mother, again, she was of that generation where that was just so important to her, you know, an Italian Roman Catholic, you know, who had experienced a great deal of prejudice, as many of her generation did, toward Italian Americans in the, you know, the urban Northeast of the United States. And just, even though her views were probably more politically conservative, Kennedy, that, you know, that was so important to Catholics of her generation. John Kennedy famously gave a speech before a group of Protestant ministers in Texas, in which he promised that, in effect, the Vatican would not be directing American policy through him if he were elected the President of the United States. Today it's astonishing to think that someone would have to do that, but that you can watch the tapes of that. It's probably, you know, posted online somewhere, of John Kennedy you know, making this promise that he would separate his private faith from his actions as a political and public leader. And again, that was the big breakthrough election. He was not the first Catholic nominee for president for the presidency. Al Smith, three-time presidential candidate, two-time nominee, probably lost the 28 election because of anti-Catholicism. So again, how much things have changed. I did an interview a couple days ago with a reporter from Catholic News Network, I think it's called. They put the story online. You can see it on there. But she started the interview with asking me about the Catholic vote. And I said, no such thing. You know, Catholics are 25% of the U.S. population. You know, today, unlike 1960, thoroughly homogenized into the general voting population of America, and they are not a distinctive voting bloc. If you want to talk about Catholic voting, break it down into subgroups for me, and then we can have a conversation. You know, Latino Catholics versus white Catholics, regular church-going Catholics versus nominal Catholics. I can give you all kinds of breakdowns as to where each group leans politically. You know, if you break it down into different subgroups. But again, I think the history of the United States is one of struggling by various groups for mainstream acceptance, struggling over time, and Catholics went through that process, and now, well, we have a majority on the Supreme Court who are Catholic. We have 2 of the 4 candidates on the presidential tickets who are Catholic. It's just not even a question anymore. So, you know, maybe that gives some hope regarding the data that I mentioned before about public attitudes toward Mormons and Muslims. So Romney may be the breakthrough in this election cycle. You know, give me one more bad economic report somewhere or flub by Obama. You know, the election's that close, and you know that could be the breakthrough right there. And over time, you know, as acceptance and tolerance grows, I think, you know, for Muslim Americans, you know, there could be a similar breakthrough. But again, for many groups, it's been a multi-generational struggle in order to attain the kind of acceptance that Catholics now have had for a couple generations since the election of John Kennedy. Yes?
I wonder if you could follow that reflection by offering maybe a compare and contrast between Kennedy's speech and then the speech that Mitt Romney gave in 2008, because he also had to make a claim for legitimacy of the role of faith in politics and his particular faith tradition. So,
yes.
You know, people don't really remember that speech or pay attention to it, but can you talk about the difference between, did they make the same kind of claims to legitimacy, yes, or was there something different?
In the general sense, they were very similar because each one was an appeal for religious tolerance and acceptance by someone who was part of a religious minority that still, at the time, was or is struggling for mainstream acceptance. So the Romney speech that he gave when he first was running for the presidency in 2008 has been compared very similarly to the famous John Kennedy speech in 1960. But it was intended, I think, to help get past abiding concerns by many Republicans whether he was electable because of his religious identity. He wanted to put that issue squarely out there at the outset when he was first running for president. And then back away from talking about his Mormon faith after he put the issue out there so openly as he did, and I think extremely well, as John Kennedy did. I mean, it is remarkable when you consider how small the percentage of Americans who are Mormon that this breakthrough could happen this year. And when you also consider the polling data, survey data, that show that there are still very significant numbers of Americans who say openly, these are people who are willing to admit it to the survey researchers, that they're not willing or less willing to vote for someone because of his, in this case, religious identity. This is actually, this reminds me, George Romney ran for president in 1968. Morris Udall ran for president, a Mormon, in 1976. You had a senator here, a Mormon, right, for a number of years. I don't remember Mormon faith in their times being, correct me if I'm wrong, a real hot-button issue. And I went back and looked at some of the coverage of George Romney's campaign. It was just not mentioned. I mean, there was more mention of his, whether he was a natural-born citizen or something, and because I guess he was in Mexico or something. His parents were in Mexico at the time he was born, or whatever. But it's really suggestive of, again, the rising salience of religion in American politics. That in 1968 it just wasn't discussed and it wasn't an issue. In George Romney's brief campaign for the presidency, but 4 decades later, it's a huge issue for his son running, who then has to give a Kennedy-like speech. So we like to think we make progress over time, but I guess that's not always the case. There was a hand up here first in the very front and then in the back.
I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the introduction of things like in God we trust on our currency and under God we allegiance, and what that says about, again, our progression over time, whether we can make progress.
Yeah.
That initially weren't included, and then given various political climates, they were added and never could say no.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. When I've done some lecturing abroad, I get this question a lot. You say you have a separation of church and state in America. Well, I've got your currency here. And your political leaders swear an oath on a Christian Bible when they're inaugurated to political office. People swear oaths on a Bible in court. Your Congress, your House and Senate open their session with a spoken, usually Christian prayer, right, to commence their business. There is a clergy of the House and a clergy of the Senate. Usually actually always someone of a Christian denomination. And so, please explain this to me. That takes a little work. And I try to explain that we have this principle of separation of church and state that doesn't mean that religion is completely excised from the public square. We can accommodate the role of religion in the public square, but government may not explicitly express a preference or give preferential treatment on the basis of religious identity. So as long as government is not favoring a particular religion, as long as government is quote-unquote neutral, to the extent that that is possible, then it does not violate our principle of separation of church and state when oaths are sworn on a Bible, or we have in God we trust on the currency and the like. So I think he said Barry Lynn was here. Is that right? Okay. I'm not sure he would agree with me. Yeah, he would. He would not agree with me. Yeah, I didn't think so. He'd say that should all be out of there, right? Yeah, it violates the principle. But it gets back to my author's contribution on Thomas Jefferson, whether Jefferson himself, in his letter to the Danbury Baptist Association, which he expressed the word separation of church and state, actually intended that there be an absolute, complete separation of religion from the public square. Well, according to my contributors chapter, Jefferson did plenty of things as president to suggest otherwise. So that's always a problem studying Jefferson, by the way. We each went to Thomas Jefferson's University. We can talk about this, but you can find Jefferson on both sides. So he's great to quote no matter where you come from. Someone in the back had their hand up, please. Yes.
You hear the idea that the right wing doesn't so much like Romney as they hate Obama.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered if you found any connection between racism and the Christian evangelicals.
Yeah. I have not found specific statistical evidence that would lend clear proof to the suspicion of many that the racial factor is an important one in white evangelical opposition to Barack Obama. Of course, what complicates it is you can't ask people these questions, right? In surveys, they're not going to tell you. The survey researchers have come up with clever mechanisms, Do you think race will matter to your neighbor's voting preference in this election cycle? So that's one of the ways they try to get around asking people, are you a racist? So is your neighbor one? Is always much more comfortable. That's actually happening. And, some of those surveys show that there is a racial component to some degree. But the size of the white evangelical opposition to Barack Obama is comparable to the size of white evangelical opposition to John Kerry, Al Gore, Bill Clinton. A little less so Bill Clinton, actually. He had some more success with white evangelicals. I think because of his own Southern Baptist roots and the like. And a better economy, perhaps too. Let's not forget that religion isn't everything. I want to leave you with that impression. But again, that's a really difficult question to answer because statistically it's really hard to prove. And I'm sorry to say I'm a social scientist and I just have to come with the facts. So I have some beliefs in here that I won't say. Okay. Yes, you had your hand up. Yes.
Two more questions and then
okay.
I need to.
Yeah, two persons who have not asked a question yet. I think you and you have not asked a question too? Okay.
Okay, what I want to know is what has changed on this particular election cycle that we've always had a hot button issue on abortion ever since Roe came out.
Yeah.
But this religious cycle, there's an unholy alliance, it seems like, between money, politics, and religion, because they're pumping tons of money into this election to be able to try to take over the Supreme Court or to somehow deal. But at the same time, if they're pro-life, how come they turn around and promote new wars on a drop of a hat?
Right.
This doesn't make sense to me. If we're pro-life, we're pro-life. So, but what has changed in this particular cycle for them to attack women, to attack, to get so radical on pro-life as to make a conception point of a personhood.
Right.
And that personhood amendment, what ramifications at some point will that have?
Yeah.
In our future?
Okay. Yeah. Politically motivated groups and individuals like to appropriate certain language because it has political appeal. And so I've always had difficulty with the language of pro-life for the reasons you're expressing. The pro-life community is anti-abortion, anti-abortion rights. There's other phrases that I think more accurately capture the meaning. So the use of the phrase pro-life perhaps is misleading, and what's causing you to express this contradiction you see in opposition to abortion rights and support for multiple wars at the same time. You know,
And contraception, which
Right.
means that they're trying to say that before the fetus is conceived, that they were going to stop.
This gets into complicated theological issues. That's, you know, which I would need a long time. And Barack Obama once gave a very unsatisfactory answer when he was asked a question on abortion at one forum in 2008. And he said that these questions about the beginning of life, and he said, that one's above my pay scale. And he got a lot of flack for that one, so I was about to say that phrase, and then I remembered that Barack Obama got in trouble for, and then he had to go on a Sunday talk show to explain what he meant when he said that he didn't mean to be disrespectful. But you know, you ask a very fair question. The social issues are playing a key role in certain battleground states right now because of the issue positions taken by some Republicans in recent years. So I'm teaching in a battleground state, Virginia, right? I cannot turn on the TV without seeing ad after ad after ad. So much money chasing so few undecided voters right now. But many of those ads are focusing on hot-button social issues, primarily ads by those supporting Democratic candidates and the president's re-election. In Virginia, there was a bill you may have heard about that would have required a transvaginal ultrasound procedure. And many women took extremely deep offense to this. A very popular Republican governor came out in favor of this legislation and neutralized his own ability, eliminated his ability to be an effective spokesman in the state for Mitt Romney, I think, and probably took himself out of the running for being vice president. You know, Virginia's Governor Bob McDonnell I'm talking about, because of the position he had taken on that issue and the severe backlash that it engendered, to the point where, you know, the late night comedic shows were doing all kinds of routines. So watch the Jon Stewart routine, Punani State. It's entitled, just watch it on YouTube, but it's a masterly dissection of the issue several months ago. But the voter, you know, a lot of voters haven't forgotten that one. And so, you know, in certain targeted areas where these issues are playing with some swing voters, and you know, the majority of whom, by the way, are women, right? Women voters in the latest presidential election cycle made up 54% of the voting population, and I think in Virginia it's slightly higher. So you know, these issues are playing a key and critical role, and you know, I think some Republicans have probably done a substantial amount of harm to their party's prospects in some election campaigns by overreaching on some of the social issues. And this is where actually I've done a lot of writing and analysis in my work on the religious right of the Republican Party in a number of my publications. And that is sort of the tension between the more pragmatic elements within the religious conservative movement who would advise against pushing really hard on some of these issues when the public isn't ready to be receptive at all, which, you know, they would argue just undermines the ability to get more Republicans in office and then ultimately promote those issues down the road, as opposed to the more purist elements in the movement who get really upset if the Republican Party candidates are not mouthing some of these extreme positions on issues. And so that leaves a real dilemma for many Republican candidates, you know, as to how they do this balancing act of holding the support of the religious conservatives on the one hand without offending a lot of swing voters on the other hand. So that's been a huge challenge for Mitt Romney, who the Democratic campaign, I think rightfully so from a politically strategic standpoint, has spent a lot of time reminding voters what Romney said as a Republican candidate for the presidency during the primary stage. where he was running farther to the right on a number of issues than he seems to be as a general election candidate. Okay, I promised one more person. I went long on that answer. Yes.
When you look historically at the religious right movement, do you think that it will continue to become more and more important in political discourse, or do you think that this is just a trend that will go away?
They're here to stay. That's my answer. And let me just give you a little bit more substance to your question in my answer. In having studied this movement over the years, one of the things that I find fascinating is how the media portrayals of the religious right movement vacillate between their taking over and their going out of existence. I mean, it's just, you know, I've read the obituary of the Christian right so many times, and I've read the stories about how they're taking over so many times. The primary core constituency of the Christian right, you know, primarily conservative, white evangelical Protestants, are estimated at somewhere between 15 and 18% of the US voting population. And that's been steadily the case for a generation now. And from one election cycle to the next, although they are actively engaged and will continue to be so into the future, there are differences in voting turnout based on whether they have candidates who they feel enthusiastic about, whether their issues are being promoted on the agenda, but there are usually marginal differences. The big difference that many people find surprising actually was from 1996 to 2000, there was a significant drop-off in white conservative evangelical voting. Actually, Bob Dole did a better job of mobilizing the religious right than George Bush did in year 2000. A lot of people don't know that. And Karl Rove had said after 2000, the key to Bush's re-election is finding those 4 million evangelicals who sat on their hands between 96 and 2000 and getting them back. And there was a huge outreach effort, you know, directly even into the churches and trying to get, you know, the rolls from the various churches of congregants, which, you know, caused some real legal issues during that campaign by the Bush campaign at that time, because they understood that re-energizing the religious right was the key to their keeping the White House. And indeed, that became known as the values voters election, when they really succeeded in ratcheting up the religious right component of voting in that election. But what I emphasize in my studies about the importance of the religious right is not whether the movement is going to take over. You know, they've been really limited in what they've been able to achieve in a policy sense, especially at the federal level, or whether the movement is dying out. It's simply not going to. But I emphasize the continuity of the movement in American politics. You know, they're active, they're engaged, they're here to stay. They have found that they can achieve real change in policy, particularly at the state and local levels in a number of areas by active engagement in politics. And I've even argued elsewhere that regardless of your viewpoint about the religious right movement, and I know it evokes some really strong sentiments one way or the other all the time, I think there is a benefit within a democratic society that people get engaged in politics and learn the norms of political behavior over time. And one of the things I had written in one of my earlier works on the religious right focused on what I call the political maturation of the movement. The early phase of mobilization of the religious right was very reminiscent of the early phases of some, say, early 20th century progressive movements, where the opponents characterized these people as pushing too hard, a little extreme. Their rhetoric sounded very threatening. Okay, they tended to take absolutist positions on issues. Their early engagement in politics showcased that they didn't really understand the incremental nature of American politics and policy making. They thought once they first got engaged in politics, and many of them got engaged because they were enraged, like the evangelical conservatives in the 70s and 80s were, that they could immediately change the landscape of American politics, and then they find out you can't do that. But over time, they learned how to play the political game much smarter and become much more sophisticated. My co-author and I, in one book we wrote on the religious right, found that the early wave mobilization was indeed characterized by taking absolutist positions on issues, demanding that Republican candidates express 100% fidelity to their issue positions, or we're going to walk on election day, using rhetoric that sounded threatening to mainstream Americans. And they got their heads handed to them time and time again by doing this, and they found out over time how to play the political game smart. But how do they do this? The elites in the movement started running training seminars, and they started getting people active and teaching them the tools of political participation. And ultimately, a lot of these people became actively involved in party politics. And we've done follow-up surveys with people we surveyed in the early 90s who first got involved in partisan politics in the early wave mobilization of the religious right, who stayed actively engaged. And in the surveys, we find they are showing higher degrees of tolerance and acceptance of people of different religious denominations or different groups in the Republican coalition. And so we make the argument that, to some degree, the rise of this movement that some people genuinely dislike because they disagree with their political views has been good for democracy because they've learned the norms of democratic behavior, and they've, in a sense, become tutored in the ways of democratic participation. Not all have been so good at getting that message and, performing their democratic citizenship duties so well. But we have seen that there is a significant maturation in their style of engagement in American politics from the earlier iterations of their political mobilization. So it's a difference of degree, I understand, and there are still some who don't put a very good face on that particular movement, but that's true of leftist movements as well in American politics. This has been fun. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.